Chapter 3. Anti-Imperialism during the Cold War. With the end of World War II and the USA as the capitalist world's unrivaled superpower, the character of imperialism changed. Colonialism had lost both its legitimacy and its raison d'etre. The administration of the colonies had become a burden for the Europeans. The end of World War II led to a wave of decolonization, driven by liberation movements taking advantage of the window of opportunity that now presented itself. Decolonization was also supported by the U.S. government, which was hoping for more influence in Asia and Africa. The global order shaped by colonialism, however, did not change. The world remained divided between rich and poor countries, and the political and economic structure that had created this divide was still in place. A recent analysis of global inequality by sociologist Joseph Boraux emphasizes the significance of the colonial legacy. Even though the colonial system was destroyed 2 generations ago, former colonizer societies continue to enjoy a strong global advantage, over and above their advantages in incomes, in terms of their redistributive institutions. Essentially, the data suggest that national schemes of redistribution have served the purpose of buying off domestic working classes and other disadvantaged or disenfranchised segments of society from the global spoils of the colonial loot, even as recently as 2 generations after colonialism's end. On the other hand, the colonial legacy is making itself felt very strongly in the context of erstwhile colonized, recently independent societies. In fact, of the 2 effects of colonialism, the negative effects of a colonial history are consistently numerically greater than the advantages derived by the former colonizers. Finally, we have been able to isolate an important additional historical legacy that contributes to increasing the likelihood of effectively functioning redistributive institutions: the institutional inheritance of state socialism. The effect of this legacy fades somewhat as we move away in time from the end of state socialism in the Soviet bloc, but the effects are still there, still statistically significant, and point in the expected direction overall. In some ways, it ought not to be surprising that history matters. As our world is organized today, the poorest societies of the world are afflicted not only by an unacceptably extreme level of global disparities in income, they are also less likely to benefit from redistributive policies, especially if they are citizens of not only poor, but, as it is very often the case, also recently independent, erstwhile colonized states, and do not have a state socialist legacy to rely on. To a large extent, the current moral panic regarding a putatively mass influx of redistribution-dependent foreign populations in the European Union's Schengen area thematizes these inequalities in a brutally direct way. That is especially so because a powerful theme of the anti-immigration, anti-asylum, and anti-human rights rhetoric uses a welfare nationalist argument. This is the world that colonial oppression and its twin, neoliberal hegemony, have left for humankind, in a nutshell. Imperialism and the Western working class. The post-war era not only signaled the end of colonialism, it also saw the Soviet Union and the new state socialist countries of Eastern Europe consolidate in an economic, political, and military bloc independent from imperialism. During the 1950s, this bloc kept the old colonial powers and the USA in check and helped national liberation movements to flourish. Decolonization was not the work of the Soviet Union, though it was the result of popular movements whose politics were often far more radical than anything advised by Moscow. India became independent in 1947, China declared the People's Republic in 1949, and many Asian and African countries became sovereign states in the 1960s. Imperialism was entering a new phase, neocolonialism, as it was soon being called, meaning that the colonies had won formal independence but were still economically and politically dominated by the old colonizers. It took until the oil shock of 1973 for imperialism to hit a crisis again. Prior to that, there was a decades-long economic boom in the imperialist nations, which cemented the welfare state. As I mentioned in the introduction to this book, I experienced this personally. Not only did the standard of living of my working-class parents increase significantly during my childhood, but my youth was characterized by the arrival of consumer society. For my confirmation, I got a tape recorder. My main interests were clothes and music. The minimum wage, unemployment benefits, health insurance, and social services mitigated the existential threats of losing one's job or falling ill. The social welfare state put a human face on capitalism. Social democratic parties were in power in numerous European countries. None of this, however, changed the character of imperialism or the way in which European workers related to proletarians in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Imperialism served the interests of both the bourgeoisie and the working class in the imperialist countries. The welfare of the nation meant the welfare of all classes. The fight for socialism was a national one. Shortly after the war, the British Labour government under Clement Attlee sent warships to the Sudan to do anything to maintain peace and order in the colony. In Kenya, the Attlee government brutally crushed workers' uprisings in the late 1940s. Strikes were prohibited, emergency laws implemented, and workers violently forced to return to their jobs. Instead of raising their pitiful wages, a salary freeze was imposed. When coal miners went on strike in another British colony, Nigeria, the Labour government did not see this as a legitimate way for workers to demand a raise. Instead, they sent security forces to restore order, resulting in the deaths of 21 miners. The situation was similar in France. The French workers' movement displayed the same pro-imperialist tendencies and the same lack of solidarity with proletarians in the colonies as the British. There was very little support when the Algerian liberation struggle was launched in the 1950s. Even the Communist Party took a racist and pro-imperialist stance, not least because they had a significant number of members among French workers in the colony. Playing a role comparable to that of white workers in South Africa, the French workers in Algeria received much higher wages than the locals and enjoyed a number of social privileges. In her autobiography, Simone de Beauvoir wrote the following about the Communist Party's inaction: it made no effort to combat the racism of the French workers, who considered the 400,000 North Africans settled in France as both intruders doing them out of jobs and as a subproletariat worthy only of contempt. What is certain is that by the end of June 1955 all resistance to the war had ceased. The entire population of the country, workers and employers, farmers and professional people, civilians and soldiers, were caught up in a great tide of chauvinism and racism. What did appall me was to see the vast majority of the French people turn chauvinist and to realize the depth of their racist attitude. In the USA, too, the white working class generally supported U.S. imperialism. The American trade union movement fully supported the government's anti-communist line and its foreign policy in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The protests against the Vietnam War were not carried out by the white working class, but by students, intellectuals, and the Black Liberation Movement. The latter took an explicitly anti-imperialist stance and condemned the U.S. occupation, domination, and exploitation of Third World countries. Heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali famously declared that he had no quarrel with them Viet Cong. If there were any reservations toward the war in Vietnam among the white working class, it was because many white working class people died in Vietnam. This, however, did not prevent powerful trade unions from organizing a Support the Boys March in New York City in May 1967. As they walked down Fifth Avenue, they brandished signs saying "Bomb Beijing" and "Drop the A-bomb over Hanoi." Later that year, 13 major trade unions gathered for their annual congresses. All in all, 3,542 delegates participated. Each congress held a vote on the war in Vietnam. A total of 1,448 delegates supported the government's policy. 1,368 wanted to see more military engagement, 471 less, and a mere 235, that is, 7%. Demanded a withdrawal of U.S. troops. Some months later, the Nixon government not only intensified military operations in Vietnam, but also invaded neighboring Cambodia. At Kent State, 12 students were shot and 4 killed during an anti-war demonstration, yet trade union support for the war only increased. Joseph Byrne, vice president of the AFL-CIO, explained in a speech why resistance against the war hurt the interests of the American working class. Suppose last night, instead of escalating into Cambodia, President Nixon said we are pulling every man out in the quickest manner, with airplanes and ships. If he had said that last night, This morning the Pentagon would have notified thousands of companies and said, "Your contract is canceled. By tomorrow millions would be laid off." The effect of our war, while it is going on, is to keep an economic pipeline loaded with a turnover of dollars because people are employed in manufacturing the things of war. If you ended that tomorrow, these same people wouldn't start making houses. During the big anti-war demonstrations in May 1970, construction workers in hard hats attacked protesters with clubs and steel pipes. Several hundred were injured, yet the police hardly intervened. The attackers were not some fringe extremists. In New York alone, trade unions mobilized more than 100,000 workers to join a rally supporting Nixon's Indochina policy. The president expressed his gratitude for this very meaningful show of support, at the end of which he received a hard hat with the inscription Commander-in-Chief. For Michael Yates, who has studied the American workers' movement for decades, none of this is surprising. Nowhere was the labor movement more nationalistic and anchored in imperialism than in the United States. While there have been individual workers, unions, and movements devoted to the concept and practice of international solidarity, these have always been a minority and suffered decisive defeats at the hands of their more numerous opponents. The historical record is both appalling and tragic. At every critical juncture, labor stood against internationalism. It would be inaccurate to say that the Danish working class supported the war in Vietnam. It was simply indifferent to it. For Danish workers, not much seemed at stake. The Sailors' Union, which was led by communists, had no objection to its members sailing to Saigon as long as they got the benefits for delivering to high-risk areas, as stipulated in their contracts. As in the USA, the resistance against the Vietnam War was carried out by young people and students. Anti-imperialism in the Third World. Decolonization brought a new name for the former colonies. They were now called developing countries. In his 1949 inauguration speech, U.S. President Harry S. Truman defined Africa, Asia, and Latin America as underdeveloped areas, while the U.S. was preeminent among nations in the development of industrial and scientific techniques. Essentially, this was an American version of Eurocentrism, implying that underdevelopment had disappeared from North America with the arrival of the Europeans. European societies were the ideal that former colonies were to aspire to. In practice, this meant ongoing post-colonial imperialism, economically, ideologically, and culturally. The supposedly developed nations, in particular, the Scandinavian countries and Canada, sent funds and experts to third world countries to improve their living conditions. Under colonialism, the West had brought civilization. Now it brought development. This was presented as an alternative to communism, which supposedly had nothing to do with development. There was another name for the former colonies that became popular. They were called the Third World. The origin of the term lies in the opposition between the capitalist West and the communist East. In 1952, the French demographer Alfred Sauvy wrote an article titled Three Worlds, One Planet for the French news magazine L'Observateur. Sauvy contended that the division of the world into two camps was too simple. There was a third world that could be included neither in Western capitalism, the first world, nor in state socialism, the second world. The term was politically loaded. Sauvy was making reference to the unproperted Third Estate's uprising against aristocrats and clerics during the French Revolution. This third world, ignored, exploited, and despised, much like the Third Estate, wants to be valued. By the early 1960s, the term had been adopted by many radical movements eager to free themselves from Euro-American dominance. They saw the problems of the underdeveloped countries as a consequence of colonialism and neocolonialism. National independence was seen as key to liberation. In its 500-year history, capitalism has shaped our social, political, and cultural life. Imperialism has divided the world into a center and a periphery. Class struggle and war have determined the power structures we are subjected to. The modern nation-state itself is a product of capitalism. Capitalism needs the state to mitigate its contradictions and to administer its expansion. Otherwise, it would hit the wall at full speed. The form the nation-state takes is determined by class struggle. It is not something that capital can impose. The state can also come in conflict with capital. The struggle for an independent nation-state can be progressive or reactionary, depending on the classes involved, the power relations between them, and the role that the nation in question plays in the global order. Nationalism in Europe on the eve of World War I was reactionary, and so is the current wave of nationalism in Europe and North America. In first world countries, national sovereignty is used to defend privileges. But this does not make the struggle for national independence reactionary per se. The national liberation struggles that fought against colonialism and imperialism were progressive. Their goal was to liberate people from oppression and exploitation. We can only evaluate struggles for national sovereignty if we can assess the nation's position within the global capitalist system and understand the class dynamics at play. A formative event for the political unification of the Third World was the Bandung Conference of 1955. Representatives of 29 Asian and African countries, China included, and of several national liberation movements gathered on the island of Java. The goal was to establish a non-aligned bloc, that is, an alliance of countries pledging allegiance to neither the West nor the East. The conference inspired a wave of global resistance to imperialism. The reason a non-aligned bloc of this kind was able to emerge lay in the hostility between West and East during the Cold War. This opened up a gap that smaller countries could enter to raise their voice and set their own agenda. Nationalist leaders such as Nehru in India, Sukarno in Indonesia, and Nasser in Egypt shared a common goal with Third World communist parties, namely economic self-reliance. But they didn't agree on the strategy to achieve it. Was a movement led by the national bourgeoisie necessary? Or rather an alliance of peasants, workers, and the middle class under communist leadership? There was no consensus on the issue, not even within the communist movement. The parties loyal to Moscow insisted that the working classes and communist organizations of the Third World were not strong enough to assume leadership and were therefore required to form alliances with anti-imperialists within the national bourgeoisie. Movements based on such alliances often advocated an ambiguous, non-capitalist road. Nasserism in Egypt was a prime example of this. The Communist Party of China, on the other hand, held the view that only an alliance of peasants and workers led by a communist party could defeat imperialism. This disagreement contributed to the split that occurred in the international communist movement in the 1960s. The people of the Third World had different experiences with nationalism during decolonization. First, nationalism appeared as a progressive tool to gain independence. It stood for the rejection of colonialism and self-reliance. But the consequences of a successful struggle for independence depended very much on the composition of the nationalist movement, its main actors, their interests, and so on, and on the relationships between the classes, bourgeoisie, petty bourgeoisie, proletariat, and peasantry. The strength of the anti-imperialist movement in the Third World nourished the hope that, once independent, Third World nations would develop welfare states or even introduce socialism. But people overlooked the fact that the First World's welfare capitalism required the reckless exploitation of the Third World. Still, the defeat of colonialism was a progressive step and brought material improvement in people's lives. As Samir Amin has noted, in 30 years, the horrible regime of Mobutu led to the production of an education capital in Congo 40 times higher than what the Belgians achieved in 80 years. But Third World nationalism was only progressive when it envisaged a clear break with the capitalist system. Otherwise, it was simply a tool to secure the power of a new national elite. Despite the often radical history of liberation movements, most focused on capitalist development once they came to power. Land reforms were rare, and mines, industries, and banks were not nationalized. This led to a slow erosion of the vision of the Bandung period, and to the decline of liberation struggles with a socialist perspective. The wave of anti-imperialist movements of the 1960s did have a strong impact on anti-imperialist theory, though. Marxist thought had not developed much since the 1920s, having mainly been preoccupied with defending the Soviet Union. If there was any theoretical innovation, it came from the Trotskyist camp. Now, however, people involved in anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggles made important contributions: Mao, Kwame Nkrumah, Amilcar Cabral, Che Guevara, Frantz Fanon, and others. They laid the foundations for what would later become known as dependency theory. Kwame Nkrumah. In 1957, Kwame Nkrumah became the first prime minister of newly independent Ghana. 3 years later, he was president. Nkrumah was a Pan-Africanist and played a key role in establishing the Organization of African Unity in 1963. In 1966, his government was ousted by a military coup backed by Western countries. Together with the work of Che Guevara, Nkrumah's 1965 book Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, was largely responsible for popularizing neocolonialism as a term. Nkrumah wrote, "The essence of neocolonialism is that the state which is subject to it is, in theory, independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from outside. The result of neocolonialism is that foreign capital is used for the exploitation rather than for the development of the less developed parts of the world. Investment under neocolonialism increases rather than decreases the gap between the rich and the poor countries of the world." Nkrumah not only analyzed traditional forms of imperialist exploitation, such as profits made from foreign investments and interest rates on loans, but also presented examples for what Argyri Emanuel later called unequal exchange on the economic front. A strong factor favoring Western monopolies and acting against the developing world is international capital's control of the world market, as well as of the prices of commodities bought and sold there. From 1951 to 1961, without taking oil into consideration, the general level of prices for primary products fell by 33.1%, while prices of manufactured goods rose 3.5%, within which machinery and equipment prices rose 31.3%. Nkrumah also addressed the situation in the imperialist center after World War II. In the industrially more developed countries, capitalism, far from disappearing, became infinitely stronger. This strength was only achieved by the sacrifice of two principles which had inspired early capitalism, namely the subjugation of the working classes within each individual country and the exclusion of the state from any say in the control of capitalist enterprise. By abandoning these two principles and substituting for them welfare states based on high working-class living standards and on a state-regulated capitalism at home, the developed countries succeeded in exporting their internal problem and transferring the conflict between rich and poor from the national to the international stage. Today, the need both to maintain a welfare state, i.e. a parasite state at home, and to support a huge and ever-growing burden of armament costs makes it absolutely essential for developed capitalist countries to secure the maximum return in profit from such parts of the international financial complex as they control. However, much private capitalism is exhorted to bring about rapid development and a rising standard of living in the less developed areas of the world. Those who manipulate the system realize the inconsistency between doing this and producing at the same time the funds necessary to maintain the sinews of war and the welfare state at home. They know when it comes to the issue they will be excused if they fail to provide for a worldwide rise in the standard of living. They know they will never be forgiven if they betray the system and produce a crisis at home which either destroys the affluent state or interferes with its military preparedness. Nkrumah strongly believed in the unity of third world countries and Pan-African collaboration as requirements to end neocolonialism. Quite obviously, therefore, unity is the first requisite for destroying neocolonialism. Primary and basic is the need for an all-union government on the much divided continent of Africa. Along with that, a strengthening of the Afro-Asian Solidarity Organization and the spirit of Bandung is already underway. To it, we must seek the adherence on an increasingly formal basis of our Latin American brothers. Although Nkrumah had identified the danger of neocolonialism and warned fellow African leaders about it, he eventually fell into its trap. Nkrumah saw the gigantic Akasambo hydroelectric dam project, originally planned by Britain's colonial administration, as key to the industrialization of Ghana. He hoped not only that it would speed up the country's electrification, but also that it would boost aluminum production, which promised to bring foreign currency to the country. But Nkrumah had great difficulty financing the project. Eventually, he agreed to bring two U.S. firms on board, Volta Aluminum and Kaiser Aluminum. Additional funding came from the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which belongs to the World Bank Group. The dam was completed in 1965, yet while the U.S. firms benefited from the highly subsidized power supply, the import of bauxite raw materials undermined Ghana's economic development. Nkrumah's attempt to finance Ghana's industrialization with the help of Western capital ended in failure. His government had not been able to control the process. Worse, corruption spread in megalomaniac projects with little or no benefit to the Ghanaian people or the country's infrastructure were funded by those in power. In addition, Ghana's cocoa industry, which had brought a considerable sum of foreign currency to the country, collapsed due to falling prices on the world market. Eventually, Africa's first independent nation was on the verge of bankruptcy. By then, Nkrumah had become an outspoken critic of capitalism and advocated a particular form of African socialism. This prompted the Western-backed coup. Nkrumah's fate serves as a prime example of the difficulties in turning formal into real independence. Amilcar Cabral. Amilcar Cabral led the struggle against the Portuguese colonizers in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde from 1963 until his death 10 years later. He was one of the era's most important anti-imperialist theorists. In a 1964 talk, he described neocolonialism. After the Second World War, imperialism entered on a new phase. On the one hand, it worked out the new policy of aid, i.e. granted independence to the occupied countries plus aid, and, on the other hand, concentrated on preferential investment in the European countries. This was, above all, an attempt at rationalizing imperialism. As we see it, neocolonialism is more a defeat for the international working class than for the colonized peoples. Neocolonialism is at work on two fronts, in Europe as well as in the underdeveloped countries. Its current framework in the underdeveloped countries is the policy of aid, and one of the essential aims of this policy is to create a false bourgeoisie to put a brake on the revolution and to enlarge the possibilities of the petty bourgeoisie as a neutralizer of the revolution. At the same time, it invests capital in France, Italy, Belgium, England, and so on. In our opinion, the aim of this is to stimulate the growth of a workers' aristocracy, to enlarge the field of action of the petty bourgeoisie so as to block the revolution. In our opinion, it is under this aspect that neocolonialism and the relations between the international working class movement and our movements must be analyzed. With respect to the class structure of Guinea-Bissau, Cabral noted that working-class settlers were often the most reactionary. The European settlers are, in general, hostile to the idea of national liberation. They are the human instruments of the colonial state in our country, and they therefore reject a priori any idea of national liberation there. It has to be said that the Europeans most bitterly opposed to the idea of national liberation are the workers, while we have sometimes found considerable sympathy for our struggle among certain members of the European petty bourgeoisie. Given the near absence of an industrial working class and the dominance of petty bourgeois forces in the national liberation movement, Cabral suggested that the petty bourgeoisie needed to commit class suicide. In his speech at the First Tricontinental Conference of the Peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, hosted in Havana in January 1966, he stated, "To retain the power which national liberation puts in its hands, the petty bourgeoisie has only one path: to give free rein to its natural tendencies to become more bourgeois, to permit the development of a bureaucratic and intermediary bourgeoisie in the commercial cycle, in order to transform itself into a national pseudo-bourgeoisie, that is, to say in order to negate the revolution and necessarily ally with international capital." In order not to betray these objectives, the petty bourgeoisie has only one choice: to strengthen its revolutionary consciousness, to reject the temptations of becoming more bourgeois and the natural concerns of its class mentality, to identify itself with the working classes, and not to oppose the normal development of the process of revolution. This means that in order to truly fulfill the role in the national liberation struggle, the revolutionary petty bourgeoisie must be capable of committing suicide as a class in order to be reborn as revolutionary workers, completely identified with the deepest aspirations of the people to which they belong. It is questionable, however, whether any petty bourgeoisies did in fact commit suicide during the course of the national liberation struggles. In most former colonies, they became powerful national bourgeoisies once the struggle was victorious. No class in history has ever committed class suicide, though individual members of certain classes have fought against their own class interests and in the interests of a different class. Cabral also had an important message for the European left about its tasks in the revolutionary struggle. There is another aspect I should like to raise, and that is that the European left has an intellectual responsibility to study the concrete conditions in our country and help us in this way. As we have very little documentation, very few intellectuals, very little chance to do this kind of work ourselves, and yet it is of key importance. This is a major contribution you can make. Another thing you can do is to support the really revolutionary national liberation movements by all possible means. You must analyze and study these movements and combat in Europe, by all possible means, everything which can be used to further the repression against our peoples. Moreover, you must unmask courageously all the national liberation movements which are under the thumb of imperialism. To end up, I should just like to make one last point about solidarity between the international working class movement and our national liberation struggle. There are two alternatives: either we admit that there really is a struggle against imperialism which interests everybody, or we deny it. If, as would seem from all the evidence, imperialism exists and is trying simultaneously to dominate the working class in all the advanced countries and smother the national liberation movements in all the underdeveloped countries, then there is only one enemy against whom we are fighting. If we are fighting together, then I think the main aspect of our solidarity is extremely simple. It is to fight. I don't think there is any need to discuss this very much. We are struggling in Guinea with guns in our hands. You must struggle in your countries as well. I don't say with guns in your hands. I'm not going to tell you how to struggle. That's your business. But you must find the best means and the best forms of fighting against our common enemy. This is the best form of solidarity. There are, of course, other secondary forms of solidarity, publishing material, sending medicine, etc. I can guarantee you that if tomorrow we make a breakthrough and you are engaged in an armed struggle against imperialism in Europe, we will send you some medicine too. With respect to European leftists criticizing certain aspects of national liberation struggles, Cabral had the following to say: "The criticism reminds me of a story about some lions. There is a group of lions who are shown a picture of a lion lying on the ground and a man holding a gun with his foot on the lion. As everybody knows, the lion is proud of being king of the jungle. One of the lions looks at the picture and says, 'If only we lions could paint.' If only one of the leaders of one of the new African countries could take time off from the terrible problems in his own country and become a critic of the European left, and say all he had to say about the retreat of the revolution in Europe, of a certain apathy in some European countries, and of the false hopes which we have all had in certain European groups." In 1973, Cabral was assassinated by Portuguese agents. Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde became independent a short time thereafter. Che Guevara. Like Kwame Nkrumah and Amilcar Cabral, Che Guevara was fully aware that national liberation was only a first step in gaining independence and that internationalism was necessary for the anti-imperialist struggle to succeed. At a February 1965 seminar on economic Afro-Asian solidarity in Algiers, he explained that it is imperative to take political power and to get rid of the oppressor classes. But then the second stage of the struggle, which may be even more difficult than the first, must be faced. Ever since monopoly capital took over the world, it has kept the greater part of humanity in poverty, dividing all the profits among the group of the most powerful countries. The standard of living in those countries is based on the extreme poverty of our countries. To raise the living standards of the underdeveloped nations, therefore, we must fight against imperialism. And each time a country is torn away from the imperialist tree, it is not only a partial battle won against the main enemy, but it also contributes to the real weakening of that enemy, and is one more step toward the final victory. There are no borders in this struggle to the death. We cannot be indifferent to what happens anywhere in the world, because a victory by any country over imperialism is our victory, just as any country's defeat is a defeat for all of us. The practice of proletarian internationalism is not only a duty for the people struggling for a better future, it is also an inescapable necessity. These were not just nice words. At the time, Che was preparing to leave for the Congo in order to support that country's liberation movement. In 1966, before leaving for another revolutionary mission, this time in Bolivia, Che wrote a message to the Tricontinental, addressing the newly formed Organization of Solidarity with the Peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, based in Cuba, in Asia, as we have seen, the situation is explosive, and Vietnam and Laos, where the struggle is now going on, are not the only points of friction. The same holds true for Cambodia, where at any moment the United States might launch a direct attack. We should add Thailand, Malaysia, and, of course, Indonesia, where we cannot believe that the final word has been spoken despite the annihilation of the Communist Party of that country after the reactionaries took power. And, of course, the Middle East. In Latin America, the struggle is going on arms in hand in Guatemala, Colombia, Venezuela, and Bolivia, and the first outbreaks are already beginning in Brazil. Other centers of resistance have appeared and been extinguished. But almost all the countries of this continent are ripe for a struggle of the kind that, to be triumphant, cannot settle for anything less than the establishment of a government of a socialist nature. The great lesson of the guerrilla's invincibility is taking hold among the masses of the dispossessed. The galvanization of the national spirit, the preparation for more difficult tasks, for resistance to more violent repression. And let us develop genuine proletarian internationalism with international proletarian armies. Let the flag under which we fight be the sacred cause of the liberation of humanity, so that to die under the colors of Vietnam, Venezuela, Guatemala, Laos, Guinea, Colombia, Bolivia, Brazil, to mention only the current scenes of armed struggle, will be equally glorious and desirable for a Latin American, an Asian, an African, and even a European. How close and bright would the future appear if 2, 3, many Vietnams flowered on the face of the globe, with their quota of death and their immense tragedies, with their daily heroism, with their repeated blows against imperialism, forcing it to disperse its forces under the lash of the growing hatred of the peoples of the world. And if we were capable of uniting in order to give our blows greater solidity and certainty, so that the aid of all kinds to the peoples in struggle was even more effective, how great the future would be, and how near. Lack of European solidarity. It was no secret that European support for the anti-imperialist struggle was very limited. In a 1973 article, Julius K. Nyerere, then president of Tanzania, compared Europe's 19th century proletariat to the poor nations of the 20th century. To him that hath shall be given is a law of capitalist and international economics. Wealth produces wealth, and poverty poverty. Further, the poverty of the poor is a function of the wealth of the rich. For the poor nations are now in the position of a worker in 19th century Europe. The only difference between the two situations is that the beneficiaries in the international situation now are the national economies of the rich nations, which includes the working class of those nations. And the disagreements about division of the spoils, which used to exist between members of the capitalist class in the 19th century, are now represented by disagreement about the division of the spoils between workers and capitalists in the rich economies. In 1963, D.N. Aidit, an influential figure in the Communist Party of Indonesia, at the time the third biggest in the world, made the following comparison: on a world scale, Asia, Africa, and Latin America are the village of the world, while Europe and North America are the town of the world. If the world revolution is to be victorious, there is no other way than for the world proletariat to give prominence to the revolutions in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, that is to say, the revolutions in the village of the world. In order to win the world revolution, the world proletariat must go to these three continents. This view was echoed by the former Deputy Vice Premier of the People's Republic of China, Lin Biao, most notably in his 1965 book Long Live the Victory of People's War. Lin Biao applied the experience of the Chinese Revolution, in which peasants had encircled and taken over urban areas, to the entire globe. He saw third world countries as the countryside encroaching on the center of the first world. Frantz Fanon, the famous political theorist and philosopher from the French Overseas Department of Martinique, criticized the dehumanizing effect that colonialism had on indigenous populations. His most famous work, The Wretched of the Earth, was an important source of inspiration both for Third World liberation movements and for African American resistance in the USA. Concerning the relationship between First World and Third World workers, Fanon wrote, "The metropolitan capitalists allow social advantages and wage increases to be wrung from them by their workers to the exact extent to which the colonialist state allows them to exploit and make raids on the occupied territories. At the critical point at which the colonized peoples fling themselves into the struggle and demand their independence, a critical period elapses in the course of which, paradoxically, the interest of the metropolitan workers and peasants seems to go counter to that of the colonized peoples. Revolutionary prospects. All of the above quotes from revolutionary Third World theorists reflect the fact that, with the exception of the Irish liberation struggle, there have been no significant revolutionary movements in the Western world since the defeat of the German, Finnish, and Hungarian revolutions of 1918-1919. The quotes confirmed that the revolutionary impetus shifted south, where it took the form of anti-colonial and anti-imperialist movements. Algeria freed itself from French rule in 1962. The Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie was ousted in 1974, while the liberation struggle in Eritrea continued. There were revolutionary movements in the Congo and in the Portuguese colonies of Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and Cape Verde. There was armed resistance against Ian Smith's settler regime in Rhodesia and militant struggle against apartheid in South Africa and South African rule in Namibia. In Asia, India became independent in 1947, the People's Republic of China was proclaimed in 1949, and the people of Vietnam chased away the French before successfully taking on the world's greatest superpower, the USA. There were revolutionary movements in the northeast of India, in Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, the Philippines, and other countries. In the Middle East, nationalist regimes led by the petty bourgeoisie had come to power in Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. The liberation struggle in Palestine received much international attention. A left-wing government came to power in South Yemen. The liberation struggle in Oman was on the rise. In Iran, there was widespread resistance against the Shah. In Latin America, the Cuban Revolution succeeded in 1959. Socialist movements were active from Guatemala to Chile. If, in the early 1970s, one looked at a map of the world and took note of all the countries that had active liberation movements, the future looked very promising indeed. Millions of people were mobilized by the promise of socialism. There were over 40 attempted revolutions in the Third World between 1945 and 1975. The Rebellion of 1968. In the midst of this revolutionary period occurred the Rebellion of 1968, which swept the entire globe. While it has become commonplace to refer to the 60s as a period of cultural upheaval, the political aspects of the era are often neglected. What was unique about the year 1968 was that rebellions occurred in all three worlds at the same time. Young people and students rose up in Western Europe and North America. Actually existing socialism was under attack in Prague. And there was unrest in many third world cities, from Mexico City to Manila. In the West, the rebellion against authority figures, parents, teachers, government officials, received the most attention. In the East, actually existing socialism seemed unable to deliver on its promise of a more equal and democratic world. The Soviet Union had made a compromise with imperialism by dividing the world into spheres of control. A new left appeared that criticized both capitalism and actually existing socialism. It addressed issues that, for a long time, had only been granted secondary status within the left: gender, race, the oppression of indigenous peoples, sexuality, ecology. While earlier generations of communists had deemed it unnecessary to deal with these questions before the class struggle brought about the revolution, younger militants insisted on dealing with them here and now. Waiting for the revolution seemed too tedious. The imperialist state was under pressure in the late 1960s and early 1970s, both because of the liberation movements in the Third World and because of economic problems and social unrest at home. In 1969, Life magazine published a series of articles under the heading Revolution: What are the causes? How does it start? Can it happen here? In the USA, capitalists felt threatened by the decline of American hegemony and the rise of radical mobilizations. In 1976, Leonard Silk and David Vogel published a book titled Ethics and Profits: The Crisis of Confidence in American Business. It was based on anonymous interviews with 360 executives from large U.S. companies. One of them stated, "The American capitalist system is confronting its darkest hour." If we don't take action now, we will see our own demise. We will evolve into another social democracy. Neoliberalism and new military strategies came to the system's rescue. But while the spirit of '68 might have vanished by the end of the 1970s, it had lasting consequences. Authority figures were no longer untouchable, and the USA was no longer a hegemonic power. The radical left had become more diverse and less hierarchically organized. And there were theoretical developments, not least with respect to the analysis of imperialism. My own political biography was strongly impacted by all of this. I was politicized in the context of the student rebellion in Denmark and the anti-imperialist resistance in the Third World. Of particular importance was my first encounter with KAK in 1969. KAK, the Communist Working Circle. The Communist Working Circle was founded in 1963, when literary historian Gottfred Appel was expelled from the Danish Communist Party, DKP. Appel had been a party member since 1945. He had joined the DKP because, like many Danes of his generation, he was impressed by the leading role it had played in the resistance against the German occupation during World War II. Appel was trained at the Higher Party School in Moscow, and upon his return to Denmark he led study circles to teach new DKP members the foundations of Marxism. He also taught Danish and English at the Chinese embassy in Copenhagen. Later, he was put in charge of the DKP Presstidens Forlag, and wrote, with a focus on foreign policy, for the DKP's daily newspaper Land og Folk. Developments in China were always among Appel's chief interests. When ideological disputes between Moscow and Beijing emerged in the early 1960s, Appel sided with Beijing. He shared the Chinese critique of modern revisionism and of peaceful coexistence with imperialism. For Appel, there was a contradiction between the Soviet Union's revolutionary and anti-imperialist rhetoric and the country's actual policies. He also agreed with the Chinese analysis that class struggle continued under socialism and that it was a reality in the Soviet Union as well as in the People's Republic of China. In 1963, Appel left Land og Folk to work for the Chinese embassy's journal bulletin. When he was expelled from the DKP shortly thereafter, he and 20 other DKP dissidents founded the Communist Working Circle. KAK was Europe's first Maoist organization and maintained close contact with the Communist Party of China. Appel visited China several times. As a KAK representative, he got to greet thousands of Chinese Red Guards marching across Tiananmen Square. KAK translated and printed Mao's Little Red Book and other CPC publications, and published its own journal, Kommunistisk Orientering. KAK members took working-class jobs in Copenhagen, for example at the Burmeister and Wayne Shipyard, the F.L. Smith Machine Factory, and the Tuborg and Carlsberg breweries. They criticized the DKP's reformism in leaflets handed out to colleagues and in union meetings, trying to radicalize the workforce. Appel was above all a Leninist. Whenever he encountered a problem, his first question was, "What does Lenin have to say?" Usually, he found an answer in the 46 volumes of Lenin's collected works he kept neatly lined up on his shelves. Appel was also very fond of Mao's On Contradiction, a text he deemed crucial for understanding the world's main lines of conflict. According to Appel, Marxism was an exact science, and he was always looking for the objective forces pushing socialism forward. A socialist future was inevitable, even if it required taking detours. Appel's belief in historical materialism was unshakable. This also had practical consequences. Unlike all other organizations of the Danish left, KAK did not mobilize against Denmark joining the European Community, the predecessor of the EU, in 1973. We felt the European Community provided the political framework required by monopoly capital, that it would accelerate capitalism's development and therefore also its downfall. In order to advance toward socialism, the Danish working class needed to be at the center of global capitalist dynamics, not tucked away in a comfortable and prosperous little country. KAK's attempts to radicalize the Danish working class were unsuccessful. Danish workers struggled for little more than higher wages. Socialism held no appeal, and solidarity with the working classes in the Third World was not on the agenda. This, in combination with the enormous spread of anti-imperialist movements in the Third World, made Appel reconsider his approach in 1966. He no doubt studied Lenin in his quest to develop a new practice. It was probably Lenin's writings on imperialism that made the biggest impression on him. At that point in time, Western Marxism had not paid them much attention for years. KAK would develop a unique profile within the European left. A series of articles under the heading Perspectives for Our Struggle were published in Communistisk Orientering. One of them explained, "The working class has no chance of toppling the capitalist class and introducing socialism before the foundation of the capitalist class has been undermined by the struggle and at least partial victory of the peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America." KAK defined U.S. imperialism as the main enemy and Vietnam as the focal point of anti-imperialist resistance. There was no possibility for revolution in the Western countries, and none would arise before the capitalist class loses the ability to exploit the former and remaining colonies. It was necessary to fight reformism and revisionism in a working class whose main base is the so-called labor aristocracy. The labor aristocracy had to fight for higher wages and better living conditions, but only superprofits allowed the capitalist class to give in to some of their demands. Once these demands were met, however, the capitalist class no longer needed to derail the working class from its historic mission to be the next ruling class and establish socialism. This was already taken care of by the leaders of the working class movement. The working classes in the imperialist countries found themselves in an ambivalent position, bribed with crumbs of the superprofits on the one hand, exploited on the other, the bribe being temporary, the exploitation being permanent. KAK's conclusion was, "The main objective task that the Danish working class is facing today is the struggle against U.S. imperialism and the active support of the Vietnamese people and of all oppressed nations and peoples in their anti-imperialist struggles. The main task of revolutionary communists in Denmark is to mobilize the working class to provide that support." In short, in order for revolutionary movements in Western Europe to reappear, the Third World had to throw off the yoke of imperialism, cut all ties with the rich countries, and stop the flow of superprofits. KAK used terms like parasite state and bribing to emphasize its political perspective. Today, the usefulness of the latter term seems limited. The word bribe suggests a conscious motive on the part of both the receiving and the giving end. However, individual capitalists did not hand individual workers any bribes to prevent them from making revolution. The working class had to fight for higher wages and to improve their living conditions. These struggles created a dynamic that allowed capital to use the payment of higher wages to expand its markets. Democratic institutions and the welfare state followed, made possible by the exploitation of the colonies. As such, at least the term parasite state remains analytically accurate. After formulating the parasite state theory, KAK had heated discussions with both Maoists and Moscow-loyal communists in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. A series of articles published in Communistisk Orientering under the title Two Lines was a polemic directed at the Swedish Communist Alliance of Marxist-Leninists, Kommunistiska Förbundet Marxist-Leninisterna, KFML, although even some of its members sympathized with KAK's position. Especially fierce were the attacks on the DKP and Maoist groups in Denmark. Unsurprisingly, KAK was not particularly well liked by the Danish left. We had a better reputation among internationalist solidarity projects and collaborated with organizations that provided material support to people and movements in the Third World. For example, Jyllandsklunsen, the twinned organization Jyllandshjälp Folk till Folk, and, in Sweden, the Emmaus movement. Eventually, our skepticism with regard to the Western working class's revolutionary potential also had consequences for our relationship with the CPC. In a letter addressed to China's embassy in Copenhagen, we criticized the revolutionary rhetoric used in Chinese reports on developments in Europe and North America. A March 1968 article in the Peking Review, for example, claimed that the American and British people have absolutely no common interests with the monopoly capitalist groups which bleed them white. Similar wording was used to describe the situation in Indonesia, in serious financial difficulties, The Indonesian fascist military regime ruthlessly exploited the broad masses of the working people and bled them white in order to meet increasing military and administrative expenditures for maintaining its military dictatorial rule. In our letter, we stated, "Dear comrades, let us put it frankly. We do not agree with the evaluation of the present situation in our part of the world, which seems to underlie the use of exactly the same wording to describe the situation in Indonesia and Latin America on the one hand, and the situation in Great Britain and capitalist West Europe on the other hand, and we earnestly request you to consider the need to differentiate. Actually, there is an abyss of difference between the economic conditions and the material and spiritual life of the broad masses of the working people in our capitalist imperialist countries, and those of the broad masses of the working people in Indonesia and of Asia, Africa, and Latin America as a whole. They cannot and they should not be treated or described alike. Our monopoly capitalists are not bleeding the working class white. That is what imperialism and local exploiters are doing in Indonesia, yes, in India, yes, but not in Denmark, not in Sweden, not in France, not in Great Britain. We added a number of concrete examples illustrating the standard of living of workers in Denmark. But the Chinese could not accept such criticism and broke off all contact with KAK. Even within KAK's membership there was tension. Several members left, accusing the leadership of anti-worker positions. Anti-imperialist practice in the parasite state. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, anti-imperialism was much more important for the European and North American left than it is today. In Denmark, resistance against the war in Vietnam was an integral part of the youth rebellion and a symbolic expression of being against the system. Demonstrations outside the U.S. Embassy in Copenhagen brought together as many as 25,000 people. When the World Bank held its 1970 general meeting in Copenhagen, protesters fought with police in the streets. Left-wing bookshops sold anti-imperialist literature, and groups in solidarity with the struggles in Vietnam, Palestine, the Portuguese colonies in Africa, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Chile had numerous members, not only in Copenhagen, but also in smaller towns. KAK was one of the first organizations to be involved in Vietnam solidarity work. It attracted many young activists, and, in 1968, the Communist Youth League, Communistische Ungdomsforbund, KUF, was founded as KAK's youth wing. In the late 1960s, much of our activism focused on demonstrations. Property destruction was an accepted form of protest. In 1969, The Green Berets, a film starring John Wayne about U.S. Special Forces in Vietnam, premiered in Denmark at a big Copenhagen cinema. In the screening hall, chairs were smashed and butyric acid poured on the carpet. We also participated in the militant demonstrations against the World Bank meeting. Our aim was not just to protest, but to actually stop the event. Molotov cocktails were thrown through the windows of the Congress Center, but sprinklers prevented greater damage. With respect to international solidarity projects, we focused on African liberation movements and, increasingly, on Palestine. At the time, it was difficult to garner broad support for the Palestinian cause. There was a lot of respect for the State of Israel among Danes because of the Third Reich and the Holocaust. In the Six-Day War of 1967, Israel was seen as the victim, and General Moshe Dayan was seen as a brave and ingenious hero who defended a small country against an all-out attack by its neighbors. Many young Danes worked as volunteers in Israeli kibbutzim, which gave settlerism in Palestine a leftist aura. Zionism, it seemed, had created a safe haven for persecuted Jews and turned an empty desert into cornfields and orange groves. The fact that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians had been forced from their homes was left out of the story. When, in 1969, KUF arranged an exhibit about Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan to draw attention to the issue, this was considered anti-Semitic. Public opinion only changed after Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982 and the subsequent massacres in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps. In 1971, KAK's efforts to provide material support for Third World liberation movements increased. Our guiding principle was, solidarity is something you can hold in your hands. We founded an organization with a rather inconspicuous name, Toge Till Africa, Clothes for Africa, TTA. Its members were all dedicated anti-imperialists, but the goal was not to push ideology. Rather, we wanted to collect as much clothing and other materials for flea markets as possible. TTA had chapters in Copenhagen and 4 other Danish towns, and during its heyday it had about 100 members overall. In the 1970s, TTA supported Frelimo in Mozambique, the MPLA in Angola, ZANU in Rhodesia, SWAPO in Namibia, and the PFLO in Oman. In the 1980s, it also supported a black consciousness project in South Africa by the name of Isandal on a revolutionary effort, as well as the New People's Army in the Philippines. We sent clothes, shoes, and medicine, as well as the money we made from the flea markets we held every month. We were able to send hundreds of thousands of crowns every year. The TTA chapter in Copenhagen stored its donations in an abandoned machine factory. On weekends, we went out to collect whatever was given to us. In the 1970s and early 1980s, people were generous. We had mountains of clothes. On weekdays and during holidays, we sorted and packed them by the ton. They were then transported to Hamburg and shipped to destinations where they could be received by the liberation movements. We had our own offset print shop, producing books, pamphlets, posters, and leaflets, both for the liberation movements and our own use. This was the legal practice. There was also an illegal one. Some KAK members committed fraud and robbery to get extra money, especially for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP. But getting money was far from the only thing we did. We had regular study circles to sharpen our theory and develop a practice that was effective, based on our own circumstances and possibilities. We went on numerous trips to third world countries to study economic and social conditions on the ground and establish contact with liberation movements. We also had regular discussions with those few organizations in the imperialist countries that shared our perspective. Political activism was a priority in the lives of KAK members. Some were professionals in the sense that they dedicated all of their time to KAK, living off of unemployment benefits. We felt that what we did was meaningful and that our practice corresponded to our theory. We saw ourselves as a tiny wheel in a big machine that was going to change the world. As mentioned above, our analysis didn't help us make many friends within the European left. Our sympathizers consisted of small groups in Sweden and Norway and of individuals scattered across the continent. But we never felt isolated. We regularly met with representatives of liberation movements and had most of our political discussions with them. Appel's understanding of politics and the role of the Revolutionary Party was inspired by Lenin and his sense for rigid organization. He was sharp, dedicated, a good speaker, and uncompromising. All of this appealed to the more radical circles of the 68 generation. Appel managed to gather a small but highly motivated group of militants around him. KAK was a very effective organization. Appel wanted its members to have the knowledge and the experience necessary to make the right moves when socialism became a possibility in Europe again. His strategy was twofold. First, liberation movements in the Third World had to be supported in order to throw imperialism into a crisis, which would lead to a revolutionary situation in Europe. Second, a disciplined and organized party had to be ready to seize the opportunity. Both aspects were closely linked, which was reflected in KAK's practice. Undercover. This also applied to KAK's illegal practice. Its purpose was to provide Third World liberation movements with material resources. At the same time, it was supposed to familiarize KAK members with illegal work deemed necessary in a revolutionary situation. We were required to develop secure communications, handle surveillance, set up safe houses, plan actions diligently, and acquire practical skills such as forging documents, picking locks, and stealing cars. We were in it for the long haul and needed to work undercover, not underground. Had our illegal practice been openly political, with communiques about expropriations and the like, we would have been chased down in no time. Our actions had to look like ordinary crimes. This made it possible for us to operate for almost 20 years. Fraud and robbery were natural choices. The proceeds served the liberation movements well, as they were in short supply of cash. Whatever they got from us, they got unconditionally. Other leftist groups in Europe which engaged in illegal practice chose different strategies. The Red Army faction in Germany attacked U.S. Army bases to support the anti-imperialist struggle in the Third World. Their actions were openly politically motivated and intended to shake up imperialism's hinterland, tear what they called the democratic mask off the German political system, and serve as an inspiration to the masses. But the Red Army faction were not fish swimming in the sea. They did not have mass support. They were forced into a defensive underground struggle which they were destined to lose. Their strategy was based on a wrong analysis of the 68 rebellion's political depth and the possibilities of broad anti-imperialist resistance in Western Europe. This was not a dry prairie where you could spark a fire, but a damp meadow. Our illegal practice ended on April 13, 1989. Various members of our group were arrested and subsequently charged with a series of crimes. We had been careless on several occasions during the final years of our work. There was not one single mistake that led to us being detected, but, cumulatively, our occasional negligence allowed the police to track us down. After 20 years of working undercover, we had simply become a little tired and incautious. Shortly after our arrest, a comrade was gravely injured in an automobile accident. His car was full of incriminating evidence, including a phone bill with the address of our safe house. This allowed the authorities to put us on trial and, effectively, meant the end of our group. Connections to North America. In the late 1960s and early 70s, the situation in the USA was in many ways different from the one in Western Europe. 12% of the U.S. population consisted of descendants of African slaves, there were indigenous nations, and an increasing number of immigrants from Latin America. The U.S. was also engaged in a war in Vietnam with hundreds of thousands of troops on the ground. The fragmentation of the American working class, racism, and the death toll of soldiers in Vietnam opened up possibilities for anti-imperialist resistance. We learned more about the struggle in the U.S. when people like Eldridge Cleaver, Bobby Seale, and Connie Matthews visited Copenhagen in 1969 and, again, in 1970. We were particularly interested in the relationship between the Black Panthers and the white left. The Black Panthers has no illusions about the Danish working class. When Eldridge Cleaver received an award from the students at Aarhus University, he had the following to say to one of the country's major newspapers: "Scandinavians are Europe's bourgeoisie. They have had it too good and don't want to get involved in anything. Politically, I am opposed to them, even if I might like them in other ways. You say that people are a product of their history. Fine, then I despise their history. I think that Scandinavians are crooked if they sit on their asses and accept what is happening in Vietnam, Korea, South Africa, and the U.S. when they have the opportunity to help. I am going to accept that prize in Aarhus, or whatever that place is called, only to piss them off, and then I'm getting the hell out of here." The Black Panthers had not come to humbly beg for our solidarity, they demanded it. On April 3, 1970, Connie Matthews gave a speech in a Copenhagen cinema to mobilize support for Bobby Seale, who had been arrested as one of the so-called Chicago 8. This was a group of 7 white militants and Seale himself, who were all charged with inciting a riot during the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. When Seale had voiced his protest during the trial, he was bound and gagged. Connie Matthews told the Copenhagen audience, "At the moment, the Black Panther Party is facing a serious problem. Are we going to wage a race war or a class war? The white left in the U.S. has proven its opportunism. They are ready to sacrifice their black allies for publicity. Racism is so ingrained in the life of most people in the U.S. that they don't even realize it exists. Yet, we think there is hope for white America, and we tell our white brothers and sisters to act now, to seize the time." In the same vein, we turn to the European left. Where do you stand, brothers and sisters? Bobby Seale was here a year ago. And Bobby told you that we aren't fighting fire with fire. We aren't fighting racism with racism, but with solidarity. And we want to fight fascism with international proletarian solidarity. This country is better informed about what is happening in the United States than any other European country. But when the people of Denmark were asked to protest the treatment of Bobby Seale, 3 people showed up, in a country of 5 million. We are making one last attempt and say, are you going to sit on your asses? As Eldridge Cleaver said, are you going to watch mass murder in the U.S. without doing anything? If that's the case, then you prove by your actions that you are just as racist as the decadent society of the United States. The ball is in your court, but there is not much time. For us, power to the people can become a reality. But can it become one for you, too? Matthews's speech made a real impact on everyone present. 1 week later, we distributed it at a big anti-war demonstration outside the U.S. Embassy. However, we never established direct contact with the Black Panthers. We liked their radical anti-imperialism, but were skeptical with regard to the possibilities of a revolutionary breakthrough in the U.S. For us, given the repressive state apparatus backed by a majority of the population, their strategy was doomed to fail. But there was another, much smaller and less well-known anti-imperialist group in North America that we did collaborate closely with, the Liberation Support Movement, LSM. The Liberation Support Movement. We first met members of the LSM in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, in 1971. We were all there to strengthen contacts with African liberation movements, most of which had their foreign offices in Dar es Salaam at the time. The LSM had been founded 3 years earlier by people whose political outlook was very similar to that of KAK. There was a particular set of circumstances in the U.S. at the time. The Tet Offensive made it clear that there would be no easy U.S. military victory in Indochina. The assassination of Martin Luther King caused black uprisings in more than 100 cities, with 46 people killed, 2,500 injured, and 70,000 soldiers mobilized to restore order. Student protests were met by violence. The unrest in the U.S. was directly linked to the liberation struggles in the Third World. U.S. trade unions and a majority of the U.S. working class opposed the uprisings and rallied behind their country. Their biggest concerns were steady work and patriotic pride. The LSM was a small organization with chapters in San Francisco, Seattle, New York, and Vancouver, Canada. Its key theorist was Don Barnett, a social anthropologist who, in the early 1960s, had visited Kenya to study the anti-colonial Mau Mau movement. He was, like Appel at the time, a Maoist and very charismatic. In 1967-1968, Barnett spent time in Dar es Salaam where he established contact with the Angolan MPLA. In 1967, he wrote the pamphlet Toward an International Strategy, which expressed many of the same views as the articles in KAK's Communistisk Orientering. For Barnett, the Third World liberation movements were in the vanguard of the anti-imperialist struggle, while the U.S. working class benefited from the superprofits generated by imperialism. In 1972, the LSM formulated 3 principles as the foundation of its political work. To say this, that labor aristocracies existed in the First World, however, is not to say that there exist at present no potentially progressive strata or elements in the metropolitan centers. By progressive in this context, we refer to those sectors of the metropolitan population which, in serving and satisfying some of their non-revolutionary interests and acquired needs, can be and sometimes are moved to act in ways which objectively advance the practice and interests of revolutionary classes in motion within imperialist society. These sectors can and should be mobilized to contribute material and propagandistic support for genuine liberation movements and revolutionary classes in the countryside. Again, we believe that certain actions, legal and illegal, peaceful and violent, can be carried out in the metropolitan centers which weaken, however slightly in the present stage, the power of the corporate ruling class and its military apparatus. Particular local tactics must, of course, be worked out by revolutionary groups in the light of concrete conditions prevailing in each metropolitan area. Given the above position, LSM's principles of anti-imperialist work can be summarized as follows. 1. To accelerate, through various concrete forms of material support, political education and ideological struggle, That revolutionary process whereby vanguard subjugated classes and peoples in the countryside are fighting their way out of the imperialist system and contributing significantly to the emergence of post-capitalist, socialist internationalism. 2. To unceasingly strive to achieve an international socialist content and direction to the various struggles emerging within the metropolitan centers as contradictions they're sharpened due to revolutionary successes in the countryside and the resulting decline in imperialist superprofits and ruling class capacity to sustain people's imperialism. 3. To work toward the formation of revolutionary internationalist structures and forms of effective collaboration across national lines, and at the same time fight against those tendencies which, if not checked, might well lead to a post-capitalist world of unevenly developed, internally stratified and competitive, if not warring, socialist countries. For the LSM, there was no doubt that Third World liberation movements were the most important forces fighting the capitalist and imperialist system. In 1968, LSM members had visited Angola to write a book about the liberation struggle led by the MPLA. They returned with a shopping list of technical and medical equipment that the MPLA needed. The practice of the LSM would subsequently focus on two things. First, disseminating information about Third World struggles in North America. Second, shipping clothes, medicines, foodstuffs, radio equipment, printing machines, and other materials to the MPLA, Frelimo in Mozambique, SWAPO in Namibia, and the PFLO in Oman. This inspired our founding of Toj Till Africa in 1971, one of our members even going to Canada for a half-year internship with the LSM. We continue to meet LSM members in Africa. They returned regularly to collect material for their information campaigns. In the 1970s, they published a series of pamphlets about members of African liberation movements. They taped long interviews with fighters in Angola, Mozambique, and South Africa, providing unique insights into the everyday reality of their struggles. Back in North America, LSM members traveled far and wide to give presentations, especially at university campuses. Their work was a huge inspiration for us. Don Barnett died in 1975. He was only 45 years old. LSM dissolved in 1981 due to internal conflicts and the decline of the African liberation movements. However, many of the organization's members remained active supporting liberation movements elsewhere, either by providing technical assistance or by joining them as combatants. Carol Ishii, for example, died in August 1981 fighting for the FMLN in El Salvador. The Weathermen, militant propaganda or militant support. We also shared many of the views of the Weather Underground, otherwise known as the Weathermen. They also saw the divide between the center and the periphery as the main contradiction in capitalism and considered Third World liberation movements, exemplified by the struggle in Vietnam, to be in the vanguard of world revolution. Their motto was, "Bring the war home." But who was going to fight at home? In the eyes of the Weather Underground, it would be the oppressed nations within the United States, African Americans, indigenous people, Puerto Ricans, immigrants from the Third World, the victims of U.S. racism. Sections of white youth were potential allies. The contribution of the Weather Underground was to raise the stakes and to move from protest to resistance in the form of civil disobedience and armed struggle. The organization's members were confident that anti-imperialist sentiments and furor at the repressive nature of the U.S. government would create an environment where militant politics could flourish. While the LSM focused on supporting the liberation struggles in Africa, the Weather Underground focused on actions in the imperialist center itself. In their first communiqué, "You Don't Need a Weatherman to Know Which Way the Wind Blows," released in 1969, they wrote, "We are within the heartland of a worldwide monster. A country so rich from its worldwide plunder that even the crumbs doled out to the enslaved masses within its borders provide for material existence very much above the conditions of the masses of people of the world. The relative affluence existing in the United States is directly dependent upon the labor and natural resources of the Vietnamese, the Angolans, the Bolivians, and the rest of the peoples of the Third World. All of the United Airlines Astrojets, all of the Holiday Inns, all of Hertz's automobiles, your television set, car, and wardrobe already belong, to a large degree, to the people of the rest of the world. This indicated a break with the traditional U.S. left, whose politics were based on demanding more for U.S. workers. The Weather Underground was accused of not serving the people but fighting them. At a Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, meeting in August 1969, Bill Ayers responded to this critique: "We thought that you don't serve the people by opening a restaurant, or by fighting for $1 more. You serve the people, that means all the people, the Vietnamese, everybody, by making a revolution, by bringing the war home, by opening up a front." But the more I thought about that thing, fight the people, it's not that it's a great mass slogan or anything, but there's something to it. There's a lot in white Americans that we do have to fight, and beat out of them, and beat out of ourselves. The Weather Underground thought of the people in global terms. This was a courageous position to take in the imperialist heartland. The Weather Underground was a small organization but had a fair number of sympathizers. Their communiques were widely disseminated in the form of reprints and photocopies. The head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, declared before the U.S. Congress in March 1971 that there were over 1,544 individuals who adhere to the extremist strategy. At the same time, there were many in the American left who, just like the government, called members of the Weather Underground terrorists and traitors. The weathermen had to choose between two kinds of actions with different objectives. The first was to target imperialist institutions and interfere with their operations. Examples were attacks on the war industry and military infrastructure. The second was armed propaganda, that is, to demonstrate the possibility of militant resistance and expose the system's weaknesses. In the end, most of the Weather Underground's actions fell into the latter category. Their targets were mainly symbolic, for example when a small bomb went off in the toilets of the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C., the heart of the beast, in March 1971. In May 1972, they targeted the Pentagon, and in June 1974 Gulf oil. Every time, the Weather Underground made sure that no one was hurt. Causing maximum damage was not the goal, the actions were meant to send a message and inspire others. It is a mistake to compare the Weather Underground to organizations like the Red Army faction or the Red Brigades in Italy. LSM member Carol Ishii wrote a comradely critique of the Weather Underground in the journal LSM News in 1975. He questioned the power of symbolic actions. The LSM did not reject armed struggle in the imperialist countries, but they felt it would be most effective if directly linked to struggles in the Third World. Ishii provided an example from Portugal, where, in April 1973, the Portuguese Revolutionary Brigades, Brigadas Revolucionárias, broke into the Portuguese Army headquarters in Lisbon and made off with numerous documents of great use to the liberation movements in the Portuguese colonies. We never had any direct contact with the Weather Underground. Our approach was different. Our actions were neither direct attacks against imperialism nor symbolic actions. They were not meant to mobilize the working class. Their purpose was to provide material support. Despite these differences, I found some striking similarities between the Weather Underground and our group when I recently read David Gilbert's autobiography Love and Struggle, My Life in SDS, The Weather Underground, and Beyond. The significance of the Vietnam War, the urge to fight the imperialist system, the desire to move from protest to resistance, all of this was part of our history, too. There are also obvious similarities in operating undercover and operating underground. Both require precautions against surveillance, fake identities, safe houses, etc. Manifest Communist Working Group. In our own political history, 1978 was a turbulent year. KAK split into three different groups due to interpersonal power struggles that escalated in the context of a campaign against gender discrimination. 1 year later, only one of these groups, MKA, remained. Myself and others who had been involved in the illegal practice belonged to this group. Gottfried Appel did not. He had gone back to a strong pro-Chinese position. In MKA, we pursued a staunch anti-imperialist course. The position of the Communist Party of China on anti-imperialist struggles was far from progressive in the 1970s. The party was preoccupied by its rivalry with the Soviet Union. Whenever the Soviet government supported a liberation movement, the Chinese did not. This resulted in China supporting some of the same Third World forces that the CIA supported, for example UNITA in Angola. In MKA, we saw ourselves as KAK's true heir. We had the same political convictions and engaged in the same practice. The main difference was a change in our internal organization. With APEL gone, individual members had more influence and decisions were made by consensus. There were theoretical innovations, too. In KAK, all discussions had started and ended with Lenin. In 1975, some of us wanted to update the analysis of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. We looked at direct investments and profit rates, and it seemed obvious to us that direct investments in the Third World were much lower than direct investments among imperialist countries. Profits from direct investments in the Third World were a little higher, much higher with respect to oil and certain minerals, than from direct investments in imperialist countries, but not enough to explain the global differences in living conditions. APEL had great reservations about adding new theorists to KAK's, very limited, canon. It was only in MKA that we were able to update Lenin with the help of the new imperialism theories of the 1960s and 70s.